Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a review of isolations, selections, and the Hippo Conservation acronym. So what we're looking at here is a species, or really the question of what is a species. And this was brought into question because we saw penguins that were all on the same island, and yet they were all different species. And so we asked ourselves, well, how is that even possible? That there could be more than 4 different species of penguins all living so closely together. Why don't they just interbreed? Why don't they just hybridize and become one type of penguin? Well, it has to do with two things. Two things occur that keep species separate from each other and also create new species in the first place. So, what is a species? Well, it has to be a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So, if it can't do both of those things, then it is not considered a species. And this can be kind of confusing to sometimes because if you look at this picture here, these two are considered the same species and these two are not, even though these look so similar and these look very different. So there's obviously something a little bit more complex than just morphology, just the way that species are structured and the way that they look. So definition of a species, they have to be able to produce viable offspring. Based on that definition, if we look at a lion and a tiger, they can have a baby and it's called a liger. That's actually a real thing. But ask yourself, what extra information are we going to need to determine if lions and tigers are actually different species? We would need to know if they can actually produce viable offspring. And if ligers can. If you meet a liger with a liger, could two ligers have offspring of their own? And the answer is no, they actually cannot. So if we look at this cladogram, we can see that the lion and the tiger are related to each other. And we can tell this by tracing it back to their common ancestor. So if we look here, and let's trace it on back. So tiger tracing its lineage back, lion tracing its evolutionary journey back. And where does it meet up with the tiger? Right here. So this would be the common ancestor between the lion and the tiger. So they definitely are related to each other. What I want to know is what caused them to separate from each other in the first place. If they originally had one common ancestor species, what might have occurred to cause this split, this divide? Well, here you go. There's 2 things that need to have occurred for speciation, the formation of species, and that is selection and reproductive isolation. So we actually started by talking about reproductive isolations in this class. So let's start there and review some of those. First up, geographic isolation. I like to start here because I think it's a little bit more intuitive that they would be physically separated from each other, physically isolated from reproducing with one another. So this is usually caused by a physical barrier like a river or a mountain or some other form of geography that's going to prevent them from interacting. We also have temporal isolation. So think T for temporal, T for time. This has to do with species being isolated from each other because they reproduce at different times and interact at different times of the day. So in this case, maybe this species, they're implying reproduces during the day, they're implying this species reproduces at night. So when they're looking for mates to reproduce, they wouldn't even come into contact with each other due to timing. We also have behavioral isolation. So this is when they just behave so differently that they wouldn't either interact with each other or maybe they just wouldn't be attracted to each other. So they are behaviorally isolating themselves, preventing them from breeding with each other. Sometimes species physically cannot mate with each other based on their anatomy of themselves at the organism level. And sometimes it goes even deeper than that, and they have different numbers of chromosomes. And so then when they were to reproduce, they wouldn't create viable and or fertile offspring. So we call that mechanical isolation. Similarly, sometimes it happens at that molecular level, or a little larger than the molecular level, at that cellular level, where the sperm and the egg aren't compatible with one another. Sometimes species can reproduce, but that offspring is not viable. It doesn't live to become an adult. Sometimes species can reproduce. They can even create viable offspring, but those offspring are not fertile. So they would still be considered separate species. And that's why horses and donkeys are considered separate species. Their offspring are not fertile. So there you have it. Those are some of the types of isolations that could separate species. Now, once they're separated, they're going to go through their own changes independently of one another. And this is where I pulled in an analogy in class. So I said, well, picture you had a best friend in preschool, and that best friend had to move away to a country on the other side of the world. Now you've been living your lives separately, your entire lives since preschool, interacting with the world in different ways, going through different life experiences, and it's changing you as a person into the young adult that you are today. So now, even though you were best friends way back in preschool, you're probably pretty different based on these life experiences. And so if you were to be reunited tomorrow, the likelihood of you becoming and remaining best friends is much smaller. Similarly, when these populations become isolated for any of these isolation reasons, once they do that, then they're going through all of these changes, these selective pressures independently of each other. And it could be that they change so much that if they were to be reunited, they would no longer be able to reproduce and create those viable offspring, in which case we would say that they are, in fact, different species. So what are some of those selective pressures? Well, let's take a look. We've got 3 different types that we learned about in this class. We learned about natural selection, sexual selection, and artificial selection. And it's all about what's selecting for which individuals are going to be successful enough to both survive and reproduce. And that's really the key there, is that reproducing, passing on to the next generation those traits that they found beneficial and allowed them to survive and reproduce in that generation. So with natural selection, think anything that has to do with nature. Think predators, think the pressure of food availability, the pressure of habitats, and climate, and battling all of those aspects. And so whichever ones are more adapted are going to survive. They're going to be able to reproduce, and then they're going to pass on those genes. A key distinction here is that they're not choosing to adapt. They're not choosing to have characteristics or mutations that allow them to fit with their environment and be more successful. They're just born with that. There's variation in the population. And that variation is key, and it's natural, and it can be caused by recombination. Think about what we learned with meiosis. And most often it's caused initially by mutations during DNA replication. So that variation piece is really important. And then you also have competition. So you have an overproduction of offspring. Some are just going to be better adapted than others. And then that actual selection part of it, some sort of selective pressure is choosing which ones are successful. Sexual selection is similar. It's occurring when there's mate choice involved. So in this case, it's less about which ones can survive. It's focused a little bit more on which ones are able to reproduce. Or in other words, which traits allow individuals to reproduce more successfully than others. So picture the peacock. It has this beautiful tail. That beautiful, colorful tail is probably not the most advantageous when it comes to hiding from a predator, but the females really liked it. So over time, the peacocks with the more colorful tails were more successful at reproducing. They reproduce, they pass on their genes, their genetics for how to have a beautiful tail. The offspring then in the next generation would have a beautiful tail as well. And you saw that this allele, this version of the gene, became more and more frequent within the population. And then the last type of selection that we have is not nature selecting which one is surviving and reproducing, not mate choice selecting which ones reproduce, but we have humans selecting which organisms reproduce and selecting for particular desirable traits. So dogs are a classic example because humans over many, many generations have selectively bred. Sometimes you'll see that as a synonym for artificial selection, selective breeding. They've selectively bred dogs from their ancestors of wolves based on the characteristics that they found the most desirable. So when you think artificial selection, think human involvement in the breeding process. So not humans impacting species. We certainly do that a lot. It has to be humans actively and directly impacting which individuals breed with one another. You can kind of practice here. We talked about a few examples in class. here with I believe it was the Gentoo penguins. They provide rocks. The males are providing rocks to the females as a sort of gift and also to help build up the nest. And then we saw, I believe, were these Humboldt penguins? They were experiencing natural selection because they were trying to avoid predators of the sea lions to try and get to their nesting site. So it was the ones that were the most swift and could evade the predators that would then survive to be able to reproduce and pass on their agility. So for the test, you would be expected to know what type of isolation we've been looking at, or what type of isolation a data set represents. Similarly, what type of selection does an isolation or does a data set represent? And then just for the sake of context, I want you to keep in mind that both of these things are related to each other because both of these things in conjunction with each other allow for speciation, allow for what was once one species to diverge into two separate species. Lastly, we took a look at this acronym called HIPPO, which lays out all of the different threats to biodiversity. So H in HIPPO stands for habitat loss, I stands for introduced species, P for pollution, the other P for population growth, specifically the population growth of humans, and then O, overconsumption. And you can test yourself, and I hope that you do because this is what you'll see on the test. If you're given a data set, can you tell me what type of HIPPO letter it might be referencing, what HIPPO factor? So in this case, it mentions human populations and extinctions, and we see that as human population increased, the red line, the vertebrate extinction also increased. So which HIPPO acronym letter would this relate to? Well, probably the second P here, population growth. Let's try one more. Let's take a look at this one. Why not? If you don't know what this plant that you see here is, this is called garlic mustard. It is a plant that is non-native. It was brought over from another country, and it has spread throughout this entire habitat that you're seeing here, preventing other native species from growing and stealing their resources. So think about what letter this represents. You got it? I would say that this is probably I for invasive species. And now when we're talking about providing evidence, you need to provide multiple pieces of evidence. And so one thing that you can do is make sure that you're including something about the definition of whatever it is we're asking you about. If it's isolations, if it's a selection, if it's which HIPPO letter, make sure you indicate that you know what that is. So in this case, what is an invasive species? Well, it's one that's non-native. And the evidence that you're using here is what I've just told you, that it's not native. In reality, you'd have to have like a little text description. But we know that it's non-native, and we know that it is harmful. Partially because of what I told you, but also you might be able to infer this from the picture, right? It's taking over. It's stealing nutrients is something that you might have even been able to infer on your own there. So stealing nutrients. Both of those things point to the fact that it's an invasive introduced species based on the definition that we came up with during class. Another thing that would be really helpful is when you tie in the data itself. So it can't just be something that you know or that fits that category. You have to be able to get some of that information from the data set itself. And in this case, something that supports these ideas is the picture. The picture shows the entire area is covered, something like that. All right, so that would be my suggestion on how to handle that type of question. Which brings me to my tips and tricks for data analysis. 1, read the titles, read the axes, read the captions of any diagram, graph, etc. first. Then try and figure out the main idea of the data set before trying to guess what kind of course concept it relates to. Once you have the main idea, then start looking for keywords that can connect it to some of our course ideas. These are some of the categories of concepts that you will be asked about: types of evidence, types of isolation, types of selection, and our HIPPO acronym. go with the most obvious choice. Yes, you can probably defend a whole bunch of different answers occasionally, but we're looking for the one that is the best fit, the one that the evidence most clearly supports based on the data set, the data that you're provided with. And be able to support it with evidence, it has to have both of these things. So just because it is a true fact about the data does not mean that it supports the claim. It might be a true fact about the graph, but does that have anything to do with what type of selection it is? If not, it's not the right piece of evidence to support that. Similarly, just because it supports the claim does not mean that the data shows that or supports that idea. So you have to have both of those pieces of evidence working hand in hand in order to make your claim more supported. All right, I hope this helps, and if you have any questions, let me know.